They thought you were naive. That's always the first miscalculation, assuming silence means stupidity, or that kindness signals weakness. But you weren't naive. You were observing how the self-proclaimed witches circled their cauldrons of gossip, brewed their potions of projection, cloaked their venom in victimhood. You didn't interrupt them. You let them cast their little spells. You let them chant their twisted affirmations, each one laced with insecurity and desperate theatrics, because you knew the truth. Real power doesn't chant. It doesn't ask. It arrives. And when you walked into the room with no disguise, no allegiance, and no apology, they felt it in their spine. That cold flicker of something they couldn't name. That was you. And they hated you for it. See, the witches had rules, unspoken codes of manipulation, emotional traps designed to ensnare those too soft to notice. They never expected someone who would notice everything and still refuse to play. You saw their performance, how they weaponized fragility, how they exaggerated their suffering to stay in control. But you didn't call it out, you just kept receipts. You tracked the inconsistencies, remembered the tone behind the jokes, the way they watched you when they thought you weren't looking. You clocked every spell before they cast it. So when you finally laughed, not out of cruelty, but clarity, it shattered them. Because nothing burns the false more than being dismissed by the real. Then came the freaks. Not the beautiful outcasts, not the misunderstood artists, no. The freaks who twisted pain into spectacle, the ones who wore madness like a costume, hoping it would excuse their cruelty. They weren't wounded, they were trained to manipulate, trained to guilt, trained to collapse into chaos the moment accountability knocked on their door. And when you didn't run, when you stared into their frenzied monologues with a stillness they could, you didn't just disturb them, you mirrored them. That's what broke them. You reflected their performance back with such clarity, they saw themselves, and they couldn't stand the view. You didn't scream, you didn't argue. You tilted your head slightly and gave that slow, amused grin. The kind of smile that says, I've seen deeper monsters than you, and I walked away untouched. That unnerved them, because freaks only perform when they know it's working, and when it stopped working, when you stopped reacting, they imploded. You became a black mirror. Their insecurities screamed against your silence, and still, you didn't flinch. You didn't validate their act, you just watched, like a scientist watching a failed experiment. Part pity, part study, no sympathy. And in the middle of this collapse, between the panicked witches and the unraveling freaks, you laughed. That's what they'll remember. Not your words, not your walk away, but the laugh. Because it wasn't cruel, it wasn't mocking, it was surgical. It was the sound of someone who knew all along and simply let them write their own downfall. That laugh, that was the release, the seal, the message. It said, I could have destroyed you earlier, but I wanted you to watch yourself break. They'll try to spin it, of course, call you narcissistic, call you cold, but that's what they do to those who refuse to play by victim rules. They didn't expect someone to come into the arena with no need for applause. That's the real terror. You didn't need followers, favors, or forgiveness. You didn't dress up your truth. You dared to walk in raw. And what they couldn't grasp, what tore them apart, was that you liked it. You liked the chaos. You welcomed it. You didn't clean your hands after confrontation. You dipped them deeper, not to destroy, but to understand. That scared them more than violence ever could. You weren't chaotic. You were calculated. And nothing shatters delusion faster than someone who plans their silence like a sniper. Psychologically, your energy triggered their unsolved puzzles. The witches projected, the freaks deflected. But you studied. You knew that certain people hide their cruelty behind their pain, and others dress their envy in compliments. You stopped falling for it. You stopped filling in their blanks. That broke their system. They needed someone to blame, and you refused to carry the weight. You returned it, quietly, elegantly, with receipts. And they've been spiraling ever since. Now they warn others about you. That's how legends are born. In whispers, in warnings, in wounds they can't explain but swear they felt. You became mythic not because you screamed, but because you withheld. You showed them what happens when someone walks through manipulation with immunity. You became the person they try to copy and cannot kill. That makes you dangerous. That makes you immortal. That makes you remembered. You didn't block their tactics. You walked through them. That's what they'll never forgive you for. They tried everything. The silent treatments dipped in artificial sorrow, the sudden closeness that felt more like a setup than affection, the emotional confessions framed to entangle rather than share. But you didn't panic. You didn't flinch. You saw the strings as they were being pulled, and instead of getting tangled, you watched them coil around their own throats. You didn't resist their manipulation. You made them realize it had no effect. That's what collapsed their entire game. It's not the act of defiance they fear. It's the unbothered neutrality. You weren't just immune, you were inoculated by experience, by observation, by pain you already dissected and reassembled into armor. The manipulators need feedback. They feed off confusion. But you didn't give them chaos, you gave them mirrors. That disturbed them. They wanted drama, but you gave them data. They offered you guilt, you handed back logic. They tried to control the temperature of the room, but you walked in with your own atmosphere, one they couldn't influence, seduce, or intimidate. That's where their fear began, because you moved like someone who already saw the entire blueprint, someone who decoded the whole operation and found it boring. You didn't shout, you didn't call them out. You watched. And that stare, calm, surgical, pitiless, did more damage than 1,000 exposed texts or screaming matches. You made them look small by simply not engaging. They couldn't lure you in with sympathy because you no longer responded to the currency of pity. You recognized that behind every sob story was a ledger, a list of debts they were hoping you'd repay. With your peace, your time, your dignity, you shredded that contract. You moved in ways they couldn't predict because you stopped playing defense. You started playing chess. And they were still trying to win in a game of tag. Their words didn't work. Their absences didn't faze you. Their sudden affection fell flat. You treated their dramatics like background noise, unworthy of analysis, let alone response. You didn't destroy them. You simply removed the illusion that they ever had power. Your immunity was never loud. That's what shattered them. You didn't go on rants or post monologues. You went quiet, and in your silence they saw something terrifying: irrelevance. Because the opposite of love isn't hate, it's indifference. And your indifference was nuclear. It stripped their tactics of all weight, all consequence, all effect. It was like watching a magician pull a rabbit out of a hat, only to realize the audience left hours ago. You didn't fight for your dignity. You stood inside it. You didn't chase justice. You became the outcome. You were what happens when someone finally masters themselves and thus becomes immune to anyone who never had the discipline to do the same. That's the truth they'll never speak aloud. That you knew. That you saw through them before they even decided how to fool you. You became a psychological firewall, impossible to breach, not because you built defenses, but because you rewrote the code. You evolved. You studied how people use their wounds as weapons, how they wield history like a club, how they turned fragility into leverage. And instead of calling it evil, you cataloged it. You made it predictable. And in predictability, it lost its power. You showed them that the moment someone stops needing approval, manipulation dies of thirst. It starves. You didn't resist them. You let their patterns expose themselves. There was a moment, they won't admit it, but they felt it, where your presence didn't feel like a person, but like truth. Unyielding, unflinching, non-negotiable. That's what you became. A walking contradiction to everything they built their tactics upon. You didn't offer an escape. You were the consequence. And what frightened them most is that you didn't deliver it with fire. You delivered it with precision. You didn't curse them out. You outgrew them. And to someone who survives by control, that is annihilation. You didn't just break the cycle, you shamed it by making it look so predictable, so primitive, so utterly beneath you. You weren't trying to win their game. You were proving that you never had to play. And when someone realizes that you could see every move they made in advance and simply chose silence, it robs them of the only illusion that matters, power. They saw it in your walk, in your calm replies, in your absence that echoed louder than any presence. They couldn't believe it, that you had decoded them and still chose to stay composed, that you were walking around with evidence of their deception and still didn't need to show your hand. That's what unmade them. You didn't become the villain, you became the verdict. Now your name tastes bitter in their mouth. They try to rewrite history, to warn others, to dress their loss as betrayal, but they know, deep down, they know they met someone rare, someone who didn't just survive manipulation but walked through it immune, and that terrifies them. Because if you exist, so does their failure. You are living proof that control only works on the unaware. You are the nightmare that haunts every schemer, the one they couldn't break, couldn't bait, couldn't bend. They see you now, not as prey, not even as predator, but as the one who saw, who knew, and simply walked on, without damage, without delay, without apology. And now, anyone who dares to play those games with you meets a different version, not angrier, not colder, but immune. You've evolved past emotional blackmail, past guilt traps, past manufactured intimacy. You read people's tactics the way a master picks up on a rookie's tell. You know when a compliment is bait, when silence is control, when empathy is counterfeit. And you don't react, you record. Because your immunity isn't just survival, it's now a strategy. A strategy born of truth, carved by pain, refined by awareness. You are what they always feared someone would become. Immune, informed, and absolutely untouchable.